My name is Professor Richard Werner. I'm Professor of Economics and Banking. And today I would like to talk about the 10th anniversary of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. This major initiative was launched in 2013 by Chinese President Xi Jinping. It was taken very seriously in China. It was even enshrined in the constitution of the Communist Party. But how important is it for the world? To understand that, we need to reflect a little bit on post-war economic development in the world and also the monetary and financial system in the world. And that started really with the Bretton Woods agreement. So we have to go back actually first to 1942, because that's when the US and UK led anti-German and Japanese international military alliance of 26 countries known as the Allies rebranded themselves as the United Nations. The growing number of military allies, which mainly consisted of Imperial Britain and its many colonies, and the United States of America and its colonies, and the US leading this event. Then the Soviet Union, although it actually dropped out from this agreement in December 45 already, and representatives of the then Chinese government all met in 1944 in a golf club resort for very wealthy guests in New Hampshire in the US in Bretton Woods. The US Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau delivered a speech. The Chinese delegation was led by the then finance minister and central bank governor Kong Xiangxi. International monetary system were finalized. It was decided that at the center of this international monetary system was going to be the US dollar. There was actually some debate because the UK wasn't entirely happy about this. Keynes represented the UK and was arguing against it. But the US won out, and a system of fixed exchange rates against the US dollar was implemented, while the dollar itself would be linked to gold and could be exchanged at a fixed price into gold. That system was to last for a quarter century until August 1971. What had happened was, this is a major privilege, and some actually criticized that America had this privilege, and America actually did proceed to abuse the powers of this privilege by creating a lot of US dollars and then proceeding to use these US dollars to purchase land, property, companies, all sorts of assets from the countries that had joined the system. That wasn't really fair. It angered many people. But of course, in many countries, the leadership had no standing to complain because there were US troops in the country. So Germany, Japan were quiet. But France was not a member of NATO, didn't really have an American army contingency in the country. It spoke up. France complained and said, listen, you're just printing dollars and buying our assets. That is unfair. And they came up with a response. They said, well, according to the rules, all the dollars you're giving us, which you've just printed, we can exchange into gold. And France proceeded to do that. Gold reserves started to decline. The Americans initially said, well, of course you can do that, and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York will be holding your gold in custody for you. That wasn't quite enough for the French, so they sent large Navy ships to New York, to Manhattan, with the captain of the ship being instructed to take his men to and go to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York in Manhattan and physically take the gold out and bring it to France. Quite dramatic. Now, when that happened a few times, it was clear the US was not going to allow this continued depletion of gold reserves. And so a famous speech was given by President Nixon on the 15th of August, 1971, in which he announced that the US would temporarily suspend the dollar convertibility into gold, which actually was a US default on its obligations to the members of the Bretton Woods system. And yeah, just remember when politicians say temporarily, still the situation today, of course, there's no convertibility into gold. But this meant that the dollar fell. And that required a response, because if the dollar was going to fall continuously, that would actually limit US power in the world and military hegemony. And therefore, the US devised ways to stop the fall of the dollar. Now, the problem was this. There were two countries, Japan and Germany at the time, that had very large trade surpluses against the world, and particularly against America. And this meant that essentially the Germans and Japanese didn't find enough goods and services to buy in America. And so the Americans thought, what do these countries need? They're not buying enough from us. We have a trade deficit. And they realized, well, they need energy. They need oil. So Henry Kissinger was sent to Saudi Arabia, and a deal was made. And this is the beginning of the petrodollar. So the gold dollar was dropped, and the new system took a couple of years to introduce, was based on the petrodollar. The story was very simple. The deal was simple with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia was the largest oil producer and exporter. And the agreement was made between, initially actually a secret agreement between the US and Saudi Arabia, that Saudi Arabia would sell its oil only against the US dollar. And in exchange, the US would protect the interests of the ruling family, the government there. It's a bit of a protection racket, isn't it? The Americans coming around and saying, oh, nice country you have, very stable, you're earning lots of money. Would be a shame if something happened to it, like regime change. So we'll protect you. And the Saudis agreed. Part of the secret deal was also that 80% of the dollar earnings, which then started to accumulate, would be invested back in the US in US treasuries. And that solved the problem that the US had huge expenditures, also off budget, black budgets for the deep state and the global military expansion, foreign wars. So this way the dollars would be earned and would come back to the US. And that's how, of course, the dollar then was supported, because Germany and Japan now needed to work hard to earn somehow dollars. They needed dollars. And that underpinned the value of the dollar. But really, to make this really work, and also to extract resources to the maximum from Germany and Japan, which really this was about. It's a transfer of wealth from Germany and Japan to the US. The US leadership thought, well, it would be better even if the oil price went up a lot. And as we now know that a lot of the information has been declassified and has been released, the so-called oil shock was actually instigated by the US. Henry Kissinger arm-twisted the reluctant Saudi Arabian oil minister to quadruple the oil price in January 74. Now, to hide that, and also to shift the blame, and also to, again, support the US dollar. Well, in 1972 and 71, the Federal Reserve had instructed the other central banks in the American sphere of influence, in the American empire, which is the Five Eyes countries and Europe and Japan, to go out and print dollars. Because if the other central banks were printing lots of dollars, America and the US dollar wouldn't look so bad. So that was another way of stabilizing the dollar at the time, while this arrangement with the petrodollar was going on. And it took a while for them to kick up the oil price in January 74. And so we know now that the inflation of the 70s was actually not due to the oil shock, because that was too late. The inflation was already there in 73. The oil price really quadrupled only in January 74. But the inflation was due to 18 months earlier, the central banks printing a whole lot of money, just like in 2020, causing the inflation of 21, 22. Same story, and again we're told it's a war and an energy shock embargo. That's the reason, just like in the 70s. They're just replaying this game when really it was something else. It was the monetary policies of the Fed. And of course, the Americans weren't happy that Germany at the time in the 70s was looking for alternative sources of energy, such as Russia, Soviet Union, which, Soviet Union delivered even during the Cold War quite safely. The US wanted to stop that, and they've achieved that somehow. Somebody blew up Nord Stream 2, the Russian oil pipeline to Germany. Well, but back to the developing countries in the Bretton Woods system. Because at the same time, in the 1950s and 60s, more and more countries received independence. And that does go back to the war. During the Second World War, the official story was that the US and the UK were fighting for freedom and liberty. But actually, they were imperial powers, and the majority of the world's population was in colonies and didn't have independence, freedom, and democracy in a meaningful sense. And therefore, from in the 50s and 60s, the pressure became stronger, and there was struggle for independence in many countries, and many countries became independent. Now, that's when modern development economics was presented. If you look up a mainstream textbook in so-called development economics, academic book for university use, for instance, they will tell you in the beginning that this development economics is a new discipline. It was really only created in the 50s and 60s when these countries, many countries, developing countries, became independent, and then we suddenly needed development economics. Well, hang on, that's kind of suspicious because if you're a colonial power and you have total control over all these countries and territories in the world, then that's a good time to implement development economics and help these countries develop and gain prosperity. But there was apparently no need for development economics because the colonial powers weren't interested in that. Well, so should the developing countries really believe them that now that they're leaving and saying goodbye, as they walk out, they get the book called Development Economics, produced by these former colonial masters? Now, trust us, we're really interested in your development. Well, what is in these development economics books? They're giving advice that it's been dished out also very strongly from these Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and the World Bank. And they focused on the advice, and in fact, it was essentially conditionality. IMF and World Bank would give money only if you do what they say, and they were focusing on telling these countries to deregulate, liberalize, and privatize. This is known as the Washington Consensus of Development Economics, because the Washington-based institutions, IMF, World Bank, USAID, US Treasury, Inter-American Development Bank, they all push this, but also the OECD, the European Brussels-based bureaucracy, which is very much influenced and under US influence. NATO is in Brussels as well. And the advice is to deregulate, liberalize, and privatize, open up developing countries to international money and foreign competition, then everything will be fine. Sadly, there is no country that has developed based on this. In fact, there's only really 5 countries or regions that have decisively moved from developing country status to developed country status, and they're all in East Asia. And they include Japan, South Korea, Singapore, and China and its regions, including Taiwan. And all these successfully developed countries that moved to developed country status, what they did is they ignored the IMF advice and did what was forbidden to developing countries to do. Namely, they adopted industrial policy, and also they did not rely very much on foreign investment. So in the late 1980s, Japanese finance ministers pointed out to the IMF and World Bank leadership that their advice just to deregulate, liberalize, and privatize was not leading to success. And instead, the Washington institution should look at how East Asian countries, including Japan, were so successful and had very high economic growth. But that was rebuffed. And essentially, the advice didn't change. Next, China made very sincere attempts at formal improvements in the IMF and World Bank structure, shareholder meetings, trying to get other countries to have more influence. because the US were dominating these institutions, but that was also rebuffed. As a result, the Chinese leadership devised a bold initiative, and that is the Belt and Road Initiative launched by Xi Jinping. So China established alternatives to the World Bank and IMF, the New Development Bank and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Banks in Shanghai and in Beijing, and also the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the BRICS group of countries, which has just recently been doubled in size, also to include many oil producers. So very interesting now, the developments just in these days as we're talking. And importantly, China, as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, does not impose its rules on the countries it's helping. Instead, it's investing its foreign exchange reserves in building infrastructure for these countries and helping them develop and trade together and together have prosperity without what the IMF and World Bank have been doing, very much interfering, dictating, even changes to the constitution. So many developing countries are really happy about the Chinese approach. And it's been quite successful. What we next need is for China to champion the establishment of many small local banks in developing countries, just as Deng Xiaoping did in China at home, to launch the rapid rise of the Chinese economy. Because this will be the alternative, the ultimate alternative to the Washington-based wrong-headed development economics, which really considers banks as unimportant and says borrow from foreigners, but that creates debt and dependence, and that's how these developing countries have really been subjugated to colonial exploitations, being forced to sell their raw material very cheaply, their currencies are depreciating, their foreign debt is going up. No, actually, they need to establish many small local banks, create their own credit and money, and have high growth development. China was so successful because Deng Xiaoping decided we need to do what works, and he dropped the Soviet-style mono-banking, one central bank, being the only bank really, and instead created literally thousands of banks, small banks, local banks, credit unions, provincial banks, savings banks, and that meant that the money creation and allocation is done by hundreds of thousands of loan officers dealing with millions of companies sending in applications which made commercial sense. Because there's so many people, they will always beat the central planners in a Soviet-style centrally planned economy with only one bank. And that system is really what developing countries also need to do. Together with the Belt and Road Initiative, then economic success will be even more impressive, and a strong middle class will be created, inequality declines, and prosperity will be accelerated. So the Belt and Road Initiative, which is connected to the BRICS initiative and complements it, there's now the prospect of a new alternative international monetary system, not based on the US dollar, that facilitates peaceful trade and cooperation and does not require oil and energy wars, as is the case with the ailing petrodollar. So it's a good moment with a decade of the Belt and Road Initiative to celebrate these strengths and further encourage everyone to engage with China and this initiative. Thank you.